This meeting of the Palo Alto Unified School District Budget Study Session has come to order. We'll be joined by our colleague in just a moment. Just wanted to start by extending my sympathies for the whole community for the tragedy that happened yesterday. I know that there are many that are struggling in our community. We have sent our deputy superintendent, Ms. Hendricks, is out at school sites along with much of our counseling staff supporting where support needs to be right now. I also would like to thank staff for their work yesterday. Decisive action and a lot of hard decisions to make on the spot with a lot of moving parts. And I'm really grateful for all the work you all did yesterday. Okay, let's get started. Today, just as a reminder, is our first budget study session. No budget decisions are going to be made today. No adds or cuts are going to be decided for sure today. We're here to start talking about what the budget may look like. And our CBO is going to bring some things to our attention that we might or might not be aware of. And I'll start by handing it off to Don. We're in a study session.
Mr. Brienza, could I first move to approve the agenda order?
Why, thank you, Mr. Dauber. All those in favor?
Aye.
Great. Thank you so much. Agenda order approved.
Okay.
Dr. Austin.
Take it from here. First, let's talk about the setup. We had talked about different ways to set up physically for today. Typically, a study session is more of a table situation. But for today, because we are using some PowerPoint presentation and we wanted to have this filmed and accurately captured, that's why we settled on this particular setup, if that was a question that you had in your mind. First of all, I'd like to thank Jim Novak and actually the entire team for the preparation for today. I will tell the board that it's a little different way of looking at things. And we are starting, and Jim will talk more about this, we're starting this process much earlier than most districts, although I think appropriately timed, so that we can gather your input before going into bringing back recommendations. One of the big goals for today is that we want to avoid playing a game that sometimes we call Nope, That's Not It, which is we bring back a recommendation at any school district and say, here's our thoughts on either an addition or a subtraction. And the board looks at us and says, wait a minute, no, that's not what we want to solve. So part of what we're trying to do is just gather some direction about places that you either like more information or would like to provide some, either a light thumbs up or a light thumbs down on some things as we go through different options. Ms. DeBrienza, before we start, do you want to talk to the community about when and where we will take the comment cards so that there's not confusion on that, and then we can kick it to Dr. Novak?
Okay, great. I might add a little confusion though. So far we only have 2 cards. I think we're going to leave it open after Mr. Novak gives his presentation. If there's anyone that wants to speak then before the board even has discussion, you can take your 3 minutes then. As a reminder, everyone gets one 3-minute chance to speak. So if you have somewhere to be or think it's important that we hear from you before we take comment, we're happy to take your comment then. But otherwise, depending on how many cards we have, I will decide how much time to leave at the end. So after the board weighs in, community can speak then. So after Mr. Novak's presentation, I'll pose that question if anyone wants to go before we take discussion. Otherwise, we'll save it to the end.
Thank you. I think it was framed up very well what I'm planning on covering today by Ms. DeBrienza and Dr. Austin, so I appreciate that. I heard loud and clear when I joined Palo Alto a few months ago that we wanted to look at the budget a little bit differently than what we've done in the past, and we've been doing that. And one of the first things that we decided to do is really have a dialogue with the board early in December about what the priorities really are and where we should be headed, and not necessarily looking at a year to year, how much more money do we have and what do we want to add and what do we want to cut, and get ahead of the game a little bit more and look at a long-term focus. So what are the real major priorities that the board has, not even in the short term, but in the long term? And then what are the areas of the budget that we need to look at, and what more information does the board need from us in terms of areas that we're spending money on that maybe we could redirect somewhere else. There's not going to be any values placed on things today. There's just going to be information that's brought up. We're going to be asking the board for general feedback, and then if you have additional information that you want back from staff, it'll be provided at future study sessions. So as Ms. DeBrienza said, there won't be any decisions made today. There'll be a lot of information gathering, and we'll get direction from the board, and we'll provide more information at future study sessions. So I've gone over the objectives. I don't know that I need to do that part again. One of the things that I've heard quite a bit since I've joined Palo Alto is why do we continuously have discussions about the budget? This doesn't necessarily come from the board, but I get it from the public every now and then. We have close to a $50 million fund balance. So why do we keep talking about budget issues? So what I tried to do is to frame this up so that it makes some sense in terms of why we have these budget issues and the discussions each year, because I think it's a little bit misleading to the public what the fund balance is and what the various components are. So up on the chart, you'll see the various components of our fund balance. We've got $48.2 million is what our estimated fund balance is as of June 30th, 2019. And the concept of this graph is that each one of the different components are a direct proportion of the size. So each one of those boxes are, directly relate to the size of the different components. So the first ones, I'm going to take it area by area in our fund balance. The first area is our basic aid reserve. That is required by board policy that the district set aside 7% of the fund balance into a basic aid reserve. There are less than 10% of the school districts in California that are basic aid or community funded districts, and their funding is based on property taxes. And as we talked about last week at the first interim report, our property taxes have ranged wildly over the last 14 years from a low of 0.77 to over 11%. So in any one year, you can have wide swings of where we get our money from. So it's very prudent that the board has the policy to set aside 7% of the reserve right off the bat for our basic aid. So that really is off the table when you look at what's left in our fund balance. The next piece is what the state requires. It's called the Reserve for Economic Uncertainties, and you have to set aside 3% of your fund balance as required by the state. So there is no discussion about that. Essentially, the Reserve for Economic Uncertainties is off the table also. The next piece of our fund balance is our restricted funds. Those are the funds that we get from the federal and state government or for various propositions or various sources that there are strings attached to them. So you cannot use the money for ongoing resources or even for one time. They're very specific about how you use the money. So any money in our fund balance that is directly related to restricted resources, we have to set aside, and those are essentially off the table too. The little green box that you see in the far bottom right corner, that's really it's small. It's a couple $100,000, but it's our warehouse inventory and various prepaid expenses. Essentially, those are off the table too. Now we start talking about some areas that are a little bit more available. The yellow is our assigned for carryovers. And those are the monies that we actually carry over from year to year, and they're given to the school sites. So technically, are they available? Yes. We have never had that practice that once we give them to the school sites, they can carry them over and they can use them, and we don't bring them back into the district. And I believe that's what most school districts do, and I wouldn't recommend that we change that practice. So assuming that we don't change that practice, that's really off the table too. Then the big blue section that you have in the middle is the assigned one-time funds. And I really have to commend the board for what they've done over the years is they've always assigned any one-time funds that come in that haven't been spent, they assign those funds for specific purposes. I think that's very wise to not use one-time funds for ongoing resources, and you can see the different components of it. We have money in our new school fund, which may need to be renamed, but essentially that's additional funds that we have for one-time purposes. And professional development, we've set aside, I believe it was $5 million a few years ago. There still is money that's left in that. We've been very fortunate to receive some educator effectiveness grants that have allowed us to maintain those funds. At some point, that will dry up. And then we have some additional one-time discretionary funds. We've been using some of those funds for one-time purposes. So those are available, but only for one-time purposes. So for purposes of budget discussions about ongoing resources, those are really off the table. So when you have a $48.2 million fund balance, and what you see that's left in the fund balance is a little over $2 million. So it would be nice if we had a much larger reserve. That would make the budget discussions go a little bit easier, but we're not in that situation right now. So what we are trying to do is to look at our priorities and different areas that we can maybe grow our reserves a little bit or just be able to reallocate funds. So that gives a general picture of what our fund balance is. What a lot of times that we've been doing from year to year is money coming in and you have budget cuts to figure out what you need to do to make your budget balance. So every year you're kind of chasing your tail, and that's what the budget study sessions a lot of times in many districts are. And we really want to get away from that practice of year to year looking at budget cuts. And what we want to do is take a longer look at what the real priorities are of the board and try to work at a long-term plan to meet those needs. Okay. So what we're planning on doing today is having two discussions. And I've framed this up in kind of a format that we can use or not, but the general idea is to come up with one of the areas that is a priority of the board, and we'd like to have a discussion about that. So whatever the issue is and how much would it cost to implement that, and that could be a range, we don't know what that is. And then we want to have a discussion. Is that something that is a immediate priority of the board, a very high priority, and we just want feedback? And then if there are additional questions or additional information that the board needs that we can bring back for an additional study session, then we would like to have that discussion. So that will be part of the discussion. And then on the other side is, are there areas of our budget that we have as expenses that we would maybe aren't getting as much of an investment out of it that we want? So we'll have a similar type of discussion. There may be a lot of questions from the board with a lot of data. We're not coming prepared with a lot of information for you, so we'll bring that back to you at the next study session also. That's the general framework of what we would like this discussion to be today, and that would be the general format. So,
Thank you. Okay. Colleagues, I hope that, I believe, Dr. Novak?
yes.
Well, you know, but it's Jim today, because it's a study session.
Jim is fine.
We're Jim.
Study session rule.
All right, definitely a Jim thing. I know that Jim framed it up as really wanting to know what our priorities are in terms of a reprioritization or add. And I have a suggestion for how we might get started rather than just popcorning to lots of different topics. One of the things that Jim had mentioned was school safety and emergency preparedness. And that's something that we haven't discussed as a board as long as I've been on the board. And I'm wondering if that just might be a topic. It might not be a long discussion because we all might say, sure, we'd like more information. But I'm wondering if we could sort of go around and see when people think about that as a topic, is that something that you think should be a focus for next year, that you need more information for? Are there any specific data that you want? Is that an okay place to start with everyone? Okay, and can I start with you, Shaunak?
Yeah, I'd like to know what types of plans we have in place, what we've done and how much it would cost to do the kinds of like classroom hardening type things that we've seen around the country and around the state to make sure that our classrooms are safe.
Sure, I would expect to get a staff recommendation about where the gaps are and how much you think it will cost to fill them.
I would be interested in this as well. I think it would be helpful to work with our Palo Alto Police Department and our other folks that we use for risk management to help us define where we might have gaps. I'm also interested, and I'm interested on this, on all of the items we talk about, to understand a couple of different scenarios. So it's not either we invest in something or we don't invest in something, that we're given some choices. And rather than trying to expect that we have some knowledge that we might not have on the board, to give us the information around what different choices would mean.
I don't have any comment on this topic. I have a different, I think I have a different view about the process, which I can either talk about now or talk about later.
Let's finish this one topic, because I just wanted to make sure we got to this topic, and then you can propose whatever. Great, okay. Perhaps not surprisingly, I think we are interested in hearing more about this. This has been something that has both interested and concerned me since I've been on the board, because we have open campuses, and I love our open campuses, and that makes them more challenging to figure out how to secure while still making them institutions of learning that are welcoming and warm and open. So I think we really look to you as staff to let us know what best practices are and what ideal staffing is, and like Ms. Payton, like Melissa said, different scenarios maybe at different price points, and what's vital and what is important and what different districts might do. So I think that would be really helpful. You may tag on, sure.
Real quick, that was a very fast whip around, and which is fine. But let me tell you what's helpful for us as we bring this item back. This is an item that we will clearly bring back. If you have a strong opinion, and I would say Jennifer mentioned open campuses, wanting to preserve that, but making them safer. That's really important information for us, so that we don't bring you back a recommendation if the board has some agreement, that we would not bring you back a recommendation of fencing around a campus. That would be a miss, and those are the misses we're trying to avoid through this process. So if there's no dissenting opinion on what Jennifer raised, then that's really good feedback. So I'm just saying, as we go through this whole thing, those are exactly the kinds of things that we're looking for. And I might ask for a clarification question of Shanik for the term of hardening a classroom, if you have some examples of what that might mean in your mind, so that we're just on the same page.
I think that I would like to see the options that you and staff think is appropriate in terms of, physically changing the doors and things of that nature. That's what I meant.
Any other thoughts you want to communicate with staff on this particular issue?
Yeah, I would just say, like, as Mike Cummin indicated, I'm really interested in hearing from staff, what their recommendations are. I don't really want to put constraints on the set of options, because, I don't know what the costs of those constraints are, either in dollars or security, so.
Okay, so two things. One, I offered that if anyone did want to give their comments before we started our comments, you are welcome to do so now. Otherwise, I would leave time at the end after we've discussed. So is there anyone whose card I have right here that needs to leave? And okay, let's take Mr. Shen now, or wants to go now. And then, do you want to share?
Whatever you like. Sure.
Okay.
Distinguished Palo Alto Unified Board members and staff, I'm Dave Shen, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in a discussion about the budget next year. Over the weekend, I emailed you all a 12-point list of items to be considered for insertion into next year's budget. 3 minutes is not enough to go through and explain a 12-point list, but let me talk broadly about the categories they cover. As co-VP of P-TECH Health and Wellness, I think a lot about the health and wellness of our students. As someone who came into the district 4 years ago, my impression is that Palo Alto Unified has been in a mode of reaction to the latest crisis. To be clear, I do in fact think that these crises are quite important and do need to be addressed, and I'm glad the district has done so as quick as it has been able to. However, I have also observed that while we combat the latest crisis, we've also left other things by the wayside. In health and wellness, I see many areas that could use improvement. The group is woefully understaffed to take care of the diverse needs of a large student body. The food we serve is acceptable, but not optimal in terms of maximizing the capabilities of our students. And we do not consistently nor adequately teach our children what to eat and how to manage their own health. It seems that in the recent area of crisis and budget difficulties that we've defaulted to statusing down support in this area. I would like to see us do better. Our crises are being managed. We must now turn our attention back to the areas that become less supported, but are no less important to the health and welfare of our children. As the #1 school district in California, our standards and abilities should match not only in academics, but also in our ability to create children who understand the short and long-term implications of eating the wrong thing, or if they make poor choices for their physical and mental health, and how to manage their health in an ever more complex environment. With an eye towards providing these resources to optimizing our children's learning ability, I think we can all agree that children who are healthy will perform even better in school. In conjunction with this effort, I have found that the district is also inconsistent in its ability to engage with and manage the interaction with parents. Some areas work well, but some do not. I understand how difficult this is. Palo Alto is not an easy place. The community often defaults to attacking and negativity in their interaction style, and that is not easy to deal with. Engaging with a community like this successfully requires special personality traits and skills. I would like to see the district open itself more broadly to the community, and I think this will require a combination of hiring and training. Our children need to spend 6+ hours in school. It is fitting that we should more easily help shape our children's experience there. In closing, I welcome the opportunity to dive deeper into my 12 budget points. I look forward to meeting with you all separately to discuss them in more detail. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shen. Okay. Mr. Collins, you had a thought.
I do. Todd, please call me Todd.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
At least I can call you Mr. Dauber.
Yeah, that's we're moving along. This process feels a little upside down to me in that, and I've spoken to the superintendent and Jim about it. I mean, we are part-time volunteer. We're a part-time volunteer oversight body. We're not educational experts. We're not experts on anything. We're elected to sit in these seats and perform this role. You guys are full-time, professional, experienced managers of school affairs, school districts. And I like to think that you've forgotten more about what's important about running a school district than we will ever know. So when we talk about what are the priorities, I mean, my priority is high academic achievement for all students and mental health and social emotional health to accompany that. And I guess I would turn the question around to you guys and say, okay, if that's a priority that the board shares, what are your recommendations for where we should be investing our time and money and disinvesting our time and money in terms of to get the best outcome? So, you know, and this is the way this has always been, at least in my experience in Palo Alto, is the board, you know, popcorns, as Jennifer put it, a lot of different ideas, and there are a lot of projects that, you know, kind of the flavor of the month, like a lot of education reform all over the country, I'm sure all over the world. But it doesn't seem very effective, and I guess I would like you all to come forward with your set of recommendations about what the top priorities are in terms of spending initiatives and savings initiatives to fund them, so that we can then intelligently evaluate those and provide an oversight and, you know, crap detection function, sounding board type function, as opposed to be the generators of, oh, I like dyslexia, oh, I like low income, oh, I like special ed, oh, I like, you know, I like social emotional health. I mean, that doesn't seem like a good way to achieve our goals. So I guess I'd be curious of what your views of that is.
Can I jump in there? Thanks. I guess I can jump in there. I appreciate your perspective, Todd, and I think this is something that we've struggled with in the past, right? Are we proposing things, and are they proposing things? And I think you're right, they are the experts, and we need to hear what their priorities are and why. And yet what Don started the meeting with is helpful for me to think about, that rather than sending them off to make a proposal and then coming back and us saying, no, fences around schools, that makes, I mean, just as an example, right? That's not what we want at all. I wonder if there's a way today, perhaps they can pose some questions just that might guide their work so that they don't go back and make some proposals that don't match with our priorities.
So just to respond to that, I do think, yeah, it would be great. I mean, but I agree with you, and I think the thing that starts with is them asking
Throwing things out.
questions.
Yeah.
And saying, here's our straw man proposal, here's our general thoughts of what the top priorities are for funding and disfunding. And, let's have a discussion about those. Again, as opposed to us kind of
Popcorning.
being the random idea generators
Melissa?
that take things from.
Having seen us do this several different ways, yes, having been up on the dais and been included in several different discussions, I think when it's been most effective is when there's been an understanding and agreement or when the top priorities are. And I don't mean the top priorities are a certain person in a certain job. What I mean is our focus this year is going to be on these major things. And I have to say, a number of years ago, when I first joined the board and we had to cut back, one of the things that happened, and I've shared this with Don, so this is not the first time he's heard this, is senior staff went and talked to different constituent groups in the community and in the schools and talked to them about priorities in a big way, not in a somebody in a job, but on what's our focus? Is it important for us to have a rich suite of programs? Is it important for these programs to be in a certain area? Is it important for our classrooms to be a certain size? So talking about big picture things, and then came back to the board with that discussion before we talked about specifically what was going to, at that point, be taken off the table. To me, that was the most helpful way for the board to contribute, because we will all have a pet project, and I'm worried that we might get tanked. So I would agree with Todd, that I think you guys have a lot of expertise. You also have the ability to talk to different constituency groups in a less fraught way than we individually do. So I would encourage us to take recommendations from staff at a high level. If we don't agree at the high level, then we're never going to agree at the individual level. But I'm worried if we get into a situation where we start talking about specific people and specific jobs.
Okay. Yes, Shaunak?
Having never participated in these discussions before, I perhaps will defer to you on process, but I would just like to say that when striking the balance between getting input from staff and then getting input from the community, I think that's the role that we play at the beginning in the high-level discussions. If we were just to take the high-level input from staff, then we might be going in a direction right off the bat that would be different than what some community members have asked of us. And since that is our role, I think it's important to have somewhat of a collaborative process in the beginning that we can, propose some high-level, broad topics that we now know are important to community members, to the PTA council, to us, and then the staff can narrow it down, and then we can move forward from there. Just a thought.
Ken?
Thanks, Jennifer. Just working on.
Using the names.
Yeah, I think that I agree with Todd's formulation of the goal that I would like to see the district strive for. I think it's I don't think it's super controversial to say that we want academic achievement for all children, and we want strong social emotional well-being, and we want to see those in a supportive relationship with each other. And I think it's correct that we are not the right source of ideas about how to do that. I'll carve out homework as an exception to that. The mistake that I have seen in the past, the organization make, if I can call it that, is in not rigorously evaluating the spending that we are doing in order to achieve that goal, and instead kind of rolling over the past into the present and assuming that 99% of the spending is correct because we did it last year, and the only thing that we can really address in terms of priorities is a sort of a tiny increment at the end. And then there's a lot of attention to that tiny increment and not a whole lot of attention to the other $249 million that we're spending. So that is what I would like to see staff do, is to evidence that what you're doing is really that rigorous evaluation of the spending that is currently going on and answering the question, is it the right spending? It's hard for me to believe that it is, just because it reflects decisions that were made a long time ago with a different set of options. And I have been in conversations, I think even sitting on the board, where there was a kind of a stakeholder approach to the allocation of money. Like we view the district as a set of stakeholders and everybody gets a piece of the pie. That is not the right way to make budget decisions. I think we want to see a needs-driven approach. I think the LCFF is actually a good kind of metaphor for how we should be approaching this. We should be looking at student needs, and those needs should be driving spending rather than looking at the district as a set of buckets that need to be filled with the dollars that we have. So that's what I'm looking for.
So thank you. I appreciate all of your perspectives. You pitched one to me that I'm ready for. This is becoming clear to me now that, when we hired Don and then subsequently hired Jim, one of the things that we as a board, before you joined us, Shonik, were really excited about was to have fresh eyes on our budget in a way that it probably hadn't been looked at in a while, just in a people that bring different experiences from different districts. And that was one of the things we specifically asked of both of you. And I think that over the past few months, you've had time to dig into that budget. So I think what maybe would be helpful for us as the board, since we are all here today, as the board has pointed out that rather than us coming up with the ideas, I'm wondering if, Don, I could pass it back to you, and you can maybe pose some questions to us about some of these topics that you have found atypical in our budget, or different in our budget, or surprising in our budget, that could give us an opportunity to reflect on them.
Can I just, right before Don speaks, because I hope we don't go into this path. It's a different path than what you just described, but we have had a tendency to say all these folks have needs, or all these folks have values that they want. So we'll just give a little bit to everybody and spread the little bit of money that we have. Well, we have a lot of money, but what's actually discretionary, spread that around like peanut butter. And I worry about getting into a place where we do that again, because when we do that, we probably can't make a real impact on anything that's really important.
Can I just add one last thing to the fresh eyes? Because I have a small bit of data that as I always try to do. I looked at our the 2018 SBAC CASB results are out, and you can find them on caschooldashboard.com.org, one of those. And I looked in particular at our district versus Palos Verdes districts, and my personal favorite, Los Alamitos in Orange County. And I look at those because they are not basic aid districts, and their average spending per pupil is as 50-60% of what ours is. And if you look at the low income student cohort in those two districts, they are both, Los Alamitos is green. They have 17% low income versus our 11, and they are green versus our yellow. And Palos Verdes is 7.4% low income, and they are blue, which is the highest ranking in low income. So those guys are spending 50 to 60% of what we spend and cleaning our clock in terms of performance on low income students. So that says to me, going back to Ken's statement, that, you know, people who have run state revenue-funded districts have ways of achieving results that we have not figured out, which means we must be putting our money into things that don't generate those results, and would suggest a huge opportunity to allocate money into things that do generate results. So I would really ask you guys with experience from those kinds of districts, to, you know, say, what is it that people in Palo Alto are doing? Because a lot of what we do is not generating the desired result. And so I'd like to see us, the number one way to improve is to stop doing that, and then just put the money toward things that we know has a positive impact. So I just wanted to.
I'll take the first shot at making a lot of friends right now. Your first question and the question of the board is, what does what we would call us a high wealth district, meaning that we have a lot of funding. What is a high wealth district doing that low wealth districts are not, and yet having similar results? This is actually a very easy answer. It may not be popular, but the answer is easy. It's a math answer. We have 87.7% of our budget in people, and Jim can share some reports that we just did on our staffing, including our number of individuals who are credentialed to teach that are not in front of classes. So for every section that a teacher is not teaching in front of students, that is roughly $25,000 investment per section. I really don't want to make a lot of comparisons between here and Palos Verdes because I'm very happy I'm here, to tell you the truth. But I will give you some comparisons just for context. We had 3 TOSA positions in the entire district. Here we have significantly more than that between site TOSAs, district TOSAs, instructional leads, and other positions. So that's an investment. It's a massive investment. In fact, we'll quantify that for you in just a second. That is not common. Does it add value? Absolutely, it adds value. And we see how we're able to move in different ways here. But if we're looking simply at the CASP results, and I'm not trivializing the CASP results, but it's one measure, it is not having the impact there for the investment. Is it impacting the classroom teacher's experience and ability to do things and collaborate and have different level of professional development? Absolutely. So this is a perfect example. If you want to look for, and I watched the budget presentations last year, there was some work around the fringes. If you really want to get to the heart of it and say, where is our big investment where you are making a choice, meaning that the board has made a choice to invest a large amount of money in staffing beyond the contract ratios and to having non-teaching sections, this is it. So if you just want to get down to it, this is it. And I'd like to turn it over to Jim to give that a little context with some of the work that we had prepared.
Sure. Well, again, without placing value on it, it's just answering the question, where do we compare in terms of class sizes and our ratios that we have? Ed Data has the information. It's a little bit old in terms of the class sizes for comparative reasons, but I think it's valid nonetheless. Our average class size throughout the district is 23.3. At the county, it's 26.1. And that's the comparative apples and apples of what they use for the CalPADS numbers. That's about a 12% difference if you look at the number of classroom teachers that would be required. Again, I'm not placing value one way or another. Is that the right number? Should we have approximately 12% more teachers than the county average? I think we have parcel taxes. We have other reasons why I think that may be a valid investment, but that's just something we should be aware of. But where you see the difference in the numbers, and again, it just is what it is, in terms of the per pupil to total teacher, certificated teacher ratio, that's where we're a little bit, there's a discrepancy on that part of it. Our per pupil ratio is 14.9, and at the county and the state are about the same. It's 21.1 at the state and 21.2 at the county. And if you just take your math and you take 12,000 students and you divide the numbers, and if you just do apples and apples again, 12,000 students divided by 14.9 would be a little over 800 for us. And then at the county and the state, it's like 566. So that's a 43% increase of what we have over the state and county averages. Again, that's just a number. Maybe it should be 60%, it should be 20%, whatever it is. And it's hard when you come back to, is it getting the results? I don't have an answer for you on that one, but at least you're seeing where we're investing our money and where we're putting it in. And is that where we should be investing our money? That's just the questions. And there may be an awful lot of questions. As I said at the beginning, we may not have all the answers. We're bringing up the topics for you, and if you have a lot more questions, staff may need to do a lot more research to get you.
Just one more little piece, and then we'll get you. To tag on to that, one of our 4 priority goals is operations, and I can tell you we have holes in operations. I think that not having someone committed, dedicated to certificated HR had a consequence, and part of the consequence is our position control is weak. It's weak. I mean, if we're going to really have this session, let's have it. Position control means being able to line up what every person in the district is actually doing in their role. And I can tell you, this was really exposed when we dug in with special ed and with Lana's assistance and Alma, our special ed director. Defining current state was more challenging than I would have expected in a district like this. So just to go back and line up who is assigned to what was challenging. In preparation for this job, I think I've told the board, I used a program called 5Sight. 5Sight is a statewide database that allows you to get in and look at trends in districts and hiring databases. And I noticed enormous growth in positions over a 5-year span while the district was flat or declining. And when I got here, it was really difficult for anyone to explain that growth in a way that made sense. It was the enrollment slightly declined or flat, flattish, but the growth in positions was large. It was so large that I thought it was an error. Getting here, it's not an error. Those are positions that exist, and I believe many of those positions were put in place. Again, not a value judgment, but I think without the knowledge of the board, I think that these are things that were put in place that you would have not necessarily seen without a great position control system. And now we're still unraveling, but I can tell you the investment, I'm saying investment because money is allocated to these positions, is huge. I'm sorry, Ms. Melissa.
Sorry. First of all, I want to thank you for saying these things, because we've never had this conversation beyond, it seems like our operations aren't as efficient as they should be. We have had some conversations about class ratios, but what we haven't had a conversation about is what does the research tell us about what's most impactful for students? And when we talk about that, I believe we'd be talking about not just test scores, but things beyond that. So I wonder if that's something we can talk about as well. Maybe not here, because I think there's stuff you'd have to bring us.
Okay, thank you for that. I think, at least for me, this is exactly what we hoped that when both of you came to join us, that we would start to really look at and talk about. And they're not easy conversations to have, but I do think that we have talked repeatedly, at least in the 2 years I've been here, about how it's very clear how hard staff is working, and yet we're not necessarily getting the results that we want in certain areas. And why is that? Because it's not that anybody's just lounging around, but when it gets to the operational effectiveness, right? And whether we know what everyone's doing and if it's the best use of our time and our staff. So I wonder if, yes, I was going to ask to go around. It looks like you, okay. So since we started with Shawnick last time, let's start with Ken this time.
I appreciate your digging into you're providing us with those insights. So what you did was to pretty scrupulously avoid putting a value on those allocations, but that really is what we need you to do, right? We need you to tell us whether or not those investments are the right investments to be making, or whether they are not paying off. I mean, the presumption based on, the data that Todd's talking about and many, many discussions over a period of years on the board is that they're not paying off in the way that we expect. And so if they are the right investments, then there's something else going on. I mean, but that's the presumption, right? Is that they're not at the right level. So we really need you to tell us what the right level is and what is a better use of those dollars. So I'm going to urge you to, I understand you don't necessarily want to present them as a problem. They're just a difference, but we need to quickly move, I think, to the question about whether those are the right allocations. I do think that there are other sort of values that we can articulate for you beyond this basic value of we want to spend dollars in a way that's effective, for students in the ways that we've talked about. For example, I think we also want to have a discussion about, which is kind of implied by your presentation of what our reserves look like, about what a kind of prudent level of spending is given our revenues and given the uncertainties associated with them. As you say, we've typically operated by trying to by matching spending with income to the extent that we can. And without a whole lot of regard for the implications of that for the future, that could leave us with spending that is unsustainably high, where we're consuming dollars that we're going to wish we had in the future, and where we are having to make cuts that we could have avoided making if we decided not to spend those dollars in the first place. You identified, to take another example, you identified those one-time reserves as sort of off limits. We've also had discussions about using those to kind of smooth out our revenue variations, right? So that we kind of bleed that money into the budget in order to cover operating expenses. You could call that a one-time expense, but it's, so I think we can have, in addition to these questions about how to allocate dollars, I think that it's important that we have a value about how we are budgeting over time, and for you to give us also your views about how we should be doing that in a way that is more prudent, so that we're not sitting here in a year or 2 years, wishing that we had done something different now. I think we can articulate that value to you. I think it's your job to say, yeah, here, based on my experience, is how we should use the dollars that we have. Here's what we actually have available to be prudent, and as opposed to the dollars that are just showing up at the door and deciding that those are dollars that we can spend this year. So I'd like to hear some discussion of that from staff as well.
Melissa, anything to add?
I agree with everything that's been said. I just do want to clarify one thing. We have a lot of money per student for California, but do know that we're competing against districts in other parts of the country that have 50% more per child than we have. So I'm not saying they're spending it better than we are, because we're competing against them and our students do well. But I do think we need to just make sure we're clarifying that when we have these conversations.
Todd?
Two things. One is, I don't think we compete against other school districts.
I think we do. We talk about New Trier, we talk about Scarsdale.
And I disagree with that, because I think we collaborate with those districts, and our kids are future collaborators with the kids at those districts. I don't think we compete with them in any meaningful sense. That implies a zero-sum kind of approach, and I don't think that's our approach with other school districts.
Maybe I should say it differently. We believe that our students should do as well as the students in those districts, and we believe that they do.
Okay. I just want to, again, reiterate this, that I think this stakeholder-type approach to developing priorities is ill-guided. I don't think the answer to where we put our money is in, if we went and took a survey and found that lots and lots of people thought that small class sizes was the highest priority, I don't think it would have, I don't think it would be should be a big influence on whether we decide that's the right thing to do. If we decide that to get high academic and high social emotional results for all of our students, class sizes and material, our job should be to educate those stakeholders about what is important rather than just respond to their existing preconceptions and preferences. I think that's a huge weakness in most school reform efforts, is that, you know, people hear things that sound good and they kind of glom to them. Melissa often mentions John Massey, so do I, who's the author of The Father of All Educational Meta-Studies from New Zealand. And a great article he wrote is The Politics of Distraction, about how districts school systems focus themselves on things that sound good and take up all their time, energy, and money. Class size reduction is, I think, number 3 on the list. And it sucks away all the energy for doing things that actually move the needle. And so, again, I think that's why it's so important to identify the things that we should stop doing, not just the things that we should do. In my experience, back when I was a management consultant, that was like my number one play in my playbook was, I don't know what you should do, but I'm going to figure out what you should stop doing. Because when we stop doing it, we're going to have a lot of time and resources to put against things that we think are better, and we're going to automatically get better, or at least we'll be able to go home earlier. At least that. So it's, I think figuring out the things that don't work that we're putting a lot of resources against is very, very important. And there's no reason to think that stakeholders, generally speaking, they have preferences, very strong preferences in many cases. But our job isn't to satisfy their preferences. Our job is to educate students. And so I think it's super important that you guys focus on that job and come back to us as experts on education about how we can do that most effectively and efficiently so we can get the best result.
Sean.
I agree with everything that everyone has said so far, but I will say that I think that there is a danger of giving too little direction if we just say, tell us what's best. Because I think that we can sort of break this down into 2 buckets, savings and additions. With savings, it does seem that staff is in the best position to tell us where reasonably cuts could be made, and then we're in the position to say that makes sense or that doesn't make sense, that's a priority that should remain in the budget, and sort of work from there. With additions, it seems like it's the other way around, because we each got on this board because we have some priorities that we came to this board with. We listen to community members who have their own priorities, and it seems that our job is to look at all those and evaluate all those and think about, you know, which one of those priorities would be the best for this district. So it seems like additions would be best coming from us in the beginning, and then, of course, you're in a better position to say, this would work, this wouldn't work, this is how we would make this work. So it just seems that we can sort of separate the two and approach them differently, and that's just my thought on that.
Thank you. There is a lot here. Thank you. I'm actually really grateful for this conversation. I'm hearing a lot of things, and I think that although I agree with my colleagues that we do want recommendations, I think that it doesn't paint the complete picture to say, oh, you tell us, because at least in the past, maybe the message is, hey, this is a different board. But if staff came next time and said, we think we're going to do away with neighborhood schools, because the numbers don't really work with that. So I think probably the board, I don't know, but probably the board was like, whoa. That's been a big priority, a longstanding tradition. There are certainly things here that whether they're the cheapest way to do it or perhaps even the best way to get a test score up, we might have other priorities like student safety. We don't want them traveling across town or whatnot. So I do think that we as 5 individuals and as a board as a whole do have some priorities that maybe people that are pretty new here might not even be aware of. So I think that's where staff is coming when they say we do need to hear what you all value, which I see different as individual
So
acts.
Jennifer, how do we get to that? Or maybe Don, how do we get to that? Because I think you bring up a very good point.
So let me finish my thought here. There's a couple of things I've heard. One, Todd just talked about sort of the difference between whether something is popular with everyone or not, and whether or not we should do it. And in the past, and I wouldn't say we shouldn't listen to what the community thinks is important, but I think one of the places we've gotten caught in the past is that if staff tries to do something that's grounded in research, and we've got the data, we haven't always historically presented such research. So staff might be on one page, very sure that this is the best thing for kids because of this is what we know. And if the community has different information or doesn't have that information, that sometimes is where the disconnect happens. Did you just? Wow. So I think if there is disagreement among the community, staff, parents, whatnot, coming with the research and the data really can help us move the conversation along, because that's what we need to know. And at least then, even if we decide against that, at least we have all the data. We have the information for us. So that seems really important to me. And while I agree with Todd that we are not the professional experts, when it does come to staffing and TOSAs, that does happen to be what I do professionally. And I know we all bring our professional expertise to the job. So I think that, to me, that's a perfect example of the complexity of the question, because it's not just a do TOSAs add or do TOSAs not add. It depends on so many things. What are we asking them to do? How are we asking them to do it? Who is in that position? What is the structure? So I think that those questions are of vital importance. And again, that is something that only you guys can do. So I think that that's going to be some of your hard work this year, is looking at, there are many FTEs here that don't have a lot of time in front of a classroom, and they serve other functions, and they might be extremely value added. They might not be. There are many ways to measure that value added, right? Is it test scores? Is it something else? Is it connectivity? Is it professional development in some other way? So one of my asks of you all, probably our chief academic officers, is to look at what are those positions? What are they spending their time doing? Are they clear as to what the goal is? Are we clear as to what the goal is? Do we have them in those positions for a very clear reason? What is the structure of the work they're doing? And how can we measure what the value add is? And that might help us make this decision as to whether or not this is a good way to be spending our money. Ken has some concerns about that. Let me just look right quickly here. You had mentioned at the beginning our class size average as compared to the county and the state. And I do think that's helpful to know. I would expect ours would be lower because we have this parcel tax, and that was one of the main values that we had when we passed the parcel tax. I am curious to know how easy it is to separate that high school versus elementary, because I know that class sizes would be smaller, but for us across the board, K-12, but if we just look at high school, how are we doing compared? And are we happy with that level? Is staff happy with that level? And do you think it's the ideal level to be? So that would be helpful for me. That's all I've got right now. It sounds like other people wanted to jump in again.
You go first.
Well, I would say a couple things. First of all, I want to disagree with Shanika. I would not make a distinction between subtractions and additions. I think they're kind of analytically the same thing. And so I do not want to suggest to you, certainly educational programs that I think we should add that are going to make some kind of a difference. I want you to be on the hook for suggesting what those things are. The fact that some previous superintendent made a decision to do something or not do something doesn't make, sort of doesn't change the character of the decisions that's in front of you, which is to evaluate what we're doing and the alternatives and decide which of them is best. In terms of in terms of the question of impact, the data that we've all seen about the disparities in achievement among students in the district is very clear evidence that what we're doing isn't working. And so it's impossible for me to go to the community and say, well, the indicators say this, but we have different indicators, or there are other values that are being achieved. You know, if we can't get similar results to districts like the ones that Todd mentioned, and many districts across the state that do better than we do for these students, there is really no other value that is going to be more important than improving that measure for me. So for example, saying that, well, we're investing in teacher professional development, so our teachers are getting higher quality professional development, but it's not, and that's a value as against, you know, student achievement in these areas. You know, that's the wrong balancing of those values in my mind, right? So I think that I would place a very high priority on improving those metrics. We can quibble with whether or not, you know, those are measured right and so forth, but I can't go to the community and say, for example, well, those are standardized test scores and, you know, those don't really measure something that's important. That's just not a reasonable position to take from my perspective, at least. I'm not arguing with anybody, but I do want to sharpen this problem for you so that when you come back, you have a answer.
So I believe there's some values we have that we haven't pushed on. And we haven't pushed on them because we don't have good data on what the impact of those values are. So it may be that if we took every bit of resources, and I am not advocating for this, but if we took every bit of resources and we tutored every kid one-on-one in addition to what they're doing in the classroom in math and English language arts, our test scores would zoom through the roof for every group, and we didn't spend any money on anything else. That might be true. I would never think that would be the way we'd want to run this district. So I do think we need to have conversations about some of the other things. Go back to something I said before. One of the things we talked about way back when I joined the board was how important is our richness of program. When I say richness of program, all the choice that students have. I know that I hear this over and over from our community, that this is one of the reasons they love being in this district. I know when Don came here, he was like, wow, do you see all the things you can choose from? Look at what we've got going at our different schools. And it is amazing. I think we need to make sure we don't lose conversations about these things in our run to be, it's all about efficiency. There may be different ways to do efficiency, but we can't have these conversations without data. So if you come back to us and say, you know, we know you value neighborhood schools, that's great. What does that mean from a financial standpoint to us? What does that mean in terms of our ability to focus on other things? And I'm not picking on neighborhood schools. I'm just saying we have a lot of these categories that are our values. I think that's where we have to have the conversation. What does it mean to have this value? We may still choose that that is the most important value, and that's okay, but we should have it in an intelligent discussion.
In the annals of organizational change, the number of organizations that failed to change enough to actually move the needle is wildly greater than the numbers that change, the ones that change too far in response to desire to move along. So my fear is not very much that we will kind of, eviscerate our core values and get rid of neighborhood schools and, get rid of program richness. It's that we will do almost nothing at all. There is a silence out here.
I tried to.
So I urge management to not, this is an opportunity to slay the sacred cows. okay? And there are a lot of sacred cows. When you have a lot of money, you have a lot of sacred cows because you can afford to feed them. So let's look at the sacred cows. Boy, that's great. So this is an opportunity with fresh eye, you know, a new board and new management to look with fresh eyes at a lot of these sacred cows, established practices that we think we value, and figure out if they are actually moving the needle on the things that we value the most. Because as Ken said, we're clearly not delivering the goods on the things that, on some of the things that I think we all agree that we value the most. And it's time to stop kind of wringing our hands about it and just kind of start putting our money where our mouth is. So I urge you to be bold.
When we talk about, for example, equity, we're not doing as well as other districts. Don't we already have a set of, for example, MATD recommendations that are sort of concrete plans? Is that a good starting point? Is that something that we could say, these are, and I'm curious to hear why not?
No, yeah, we should.
Well, from Don.
Would you like to answer that?
I'd say we have foundational work that we can build upon. I would say it is not, no single document in this district is so evolved that it's going to guide us into the future. It was great foundational work. For the time it was created, it was great. I think that would have been something I would have celebrated if I were here for it. Now I see it as a foundation piece to build upon. That's where we're at, and that's where we're spending our time. Right now is trying to find the things that are actionable and concrete and take those next steps with it. But if you go back and review all the documents that have been created over time, and this will be true in places I've been to, is they were right for the time in which they were created. But over time, they lose the power, the extreme focus, and you need to keep refocusing. That's where we're at this point.
While we're on the topic of equity, thank you.
Did you want to see if Shawnick wanted to?
Oh, did you have more?
No.
Okay. Thanks. I would like to see at our next budget study session, perhaps in addition to other ways we might put resources towards students themselves who are not yet meeting standard on our standardized tests, how we might look inward and how we might spend some resources in changing the organization itself, so that rather than focusing the students on something that need to be fixed, looking at how our system perhaps isn't serving them in a way that allows them to be successful, and what sort of training, reflection, systems work might happen, and is there a dollar amount to that, so that it would make it easier to do the things we're trying to do, because we will have a system that is more prepared for them to be successful. I don't know if I said that well, but okay. I think we've given you some more of an idea of what we would like. I think some of us are more interested in just hearing from you without throwing some ideas out there ourselves. But I do know that we do have we do have values and priorities as a district, and I think that's what you're coming to assess, right? That you want to make sure you don't trample on those. So I don't know if you have any more questions for us.
Can I just ask? I mean, I feel like we hijacked the discussion a little bit onto, you know, what is it we're doing here? But people may have come prepared, as I think staff asked, with specific ideas. So it's really your call. But if people have things that they want to share.
Oh, us, you're saying?
Yeah, if they did have things that they wanted to share, I didn't want to.
Funny, because I thought I heard like, no, they do not have popcorn ideas they want to share. But let me first, while we're on this train, let me bring it back to Don and see if there's any other questions you have for us about our values and priorities, you know, such as getting rid of neighborhood schools, you know, just as an example of things that you want to know. Are they landmines?
I'm
Or
going to
things?
clarify that because you're scaring people right now.
There you go, right?
First of all, Jim and I and the entire team over-prepared, so we could have taken this in any direction that we went. So thanks to everybody for doing that work. Next, we did not anticipate the direction this went, but it's actually been very helpful.
Yeah.
Because what I'm hearing now is there are some areas you want some bold recommendations coming back, and I've got to tell you that with Mr. Collins, with Todd's comment about organizations typically not doing enough in transitions and change, I 100% agree with that. We just want to make sure that when we do it with all of the best information and that you have the best information. And part of the reason we've gone slow is because it's been, as I already mentioned, challenging to define current state. And we're going to get better there. That fourth goal of organization, fourth priority goal, is part of the reason you brought me here, and that's part of why I've spent so much time with our team. And I got to tell you, it's frustrating work because that doesn't feel like we're having that connection with students and staff that we're going to get to. But until that work is right, we can't position anything well for the future. So we can definitely come back to you with some strong recommendations. The one piece about community schools that I do want to touch on for a second, because this will be a perfect values exercise for us with a concrete example. And I actually asked Barbara Best to be here also, and she's here. So if we have specific questions, we may ask him. You ask a difference between here and some other places. Here's another one. I'll give you a real life example. If you are attending Briones as a kindergartner, so you're coming to our district, you either have lived here forever, you moved in, whatever that case may be, and we have 19-1 in kindergarten plus an aide, okay? And we get to a place where, let's say it's late August or even September, and we receive 2 more kids, and that happens to tip us over into a place where we, by contract, are over the contract. Currently, this district would add a teacher and an aide. So while the budgeting does depend somewhat on the level of the teacher that we employ, you know, it's somewhere around $140,000 total investment. Well, divide that by 2, that's a pretty big investment for those 2 students. Some districts will say neighborhood schools are defined as schools that are close to your neighborhood, which in this case could mean Briones, it could mean Barron Park, it might mean a different school in that area. We don't do a lot of that, but that's an example of Barbara could do that work easily from her position. I don't mean easily as in communicating, I mean easily as in she could find spaces in a lot of places. And in my last district, that would be absolutely common. You could buy a house across the street. If you bought it late, then you would be pushed to a different school if that spot was closed. So that's a concrete example I'd like to hear your thoughts about.
Can I just, I had 2 things. One is the first, is it okay that I'm jumping in here?
That is
am
okay
anyway.
that you're jumping in.
I don't know when we went from it's about the cluster, the neighborhood schools is about keeping students in the cluster, to it's about the individual school. I think somehow we floated there without having a board discussion, because the board talked about a cluster. So anyway, so that's why I think if we have ideas that we want to talk about, you need to bring us enough background information so we really can talk about it. The other thing I'm going to ask you is that rather than saving all of this for the next budget study session, maybe individual topics like our neighborhood schools policy and values should be a discussion at a board meeting in and of itself. Maybe the things that make the most impact on student success, maybe if you could bring in some expertise on that, I would encourage us to have that as a board discussion separate from budget study session. There are a couple of other things that I think maybe my colleagues can chime in on that might be valuable in that way.
Does anyone have anything they would like to add about this topic that Don has presented to us?
Well, I mean, most of most questions like this, I think, come down to the relative cost. So there obviously is a value to having students attend the school that's closest to them, right? How much will it cost us to actually, implement that as against other alternatives? I think that's the question. Is there an absolute constraint that students need to attend the school that is physically closest to them, or the one that they expected to when their parents bought the house? No, I don't think that's the case. I'm a little curious about that example. Is this a material problem? In other words, is there something that turns on the answer to this that it sort of rises to the level of the budget as a whole?
I think some of that's just going to depend on year by year. My previous experience, there were times when it came in clusters, and there were quite a few, and there were years where it was a non-issue. But if this is, I think Melissa's point that some of these things can come back into a regular board meeting, this is a perfect example. This would be very easy for us to quantify and bring back and frame up the issue and bring Barbara in for her experience. And we can give you a really good answer with that quickly.
Let me to respond to that, just please don't bring us questions that aren't important questions. That's why I asked about materiality, basically, and come with a recommendation. I think there's a lot of things that we could talk about that probably don't really matter a whole lot in terms of the budget, or that you could make a call or a recommendation. We don't need to explicate all of our values on every topic, I guess. I'm sure you're not looking for that, but.
So along those lines, let's just push on this for just a second. If we've been operating off of a false assumption, which is very possible, look around the room, almost nobody in this room has been here for 5 years, right? Or at least not in their position.
Ms. Ovek may,
Besides for the parents,
Brown may disagree.
yes, we have a few. The percentage is low. If we're operating off a false assumption, you could tell us that right now, and there would be really no need to bring it back. We'd operate within reason. We could make those easy adjustments, call it staff work, and we're fine. Part of what we were bringing to you today is to determine which ones are which. So.
Yeah, if I could, I wanted to make that same general point. I think it sounds like that is a false assumption. That was never my understanding of our policy and our practices. In fact, I know or 100% certain that our practices were quite different than that 5 years ago. And to the point that you made earlier, or maybe Jim made earlier, I think, stepping back, we've had a tsunami of money. You said this in a different way, a tsunami. We had a tsunami of money which we spent on staff over the last 5, 6, 7 years. We've had phenomenal assessed value property tax growth and flat enrollment. So we've had per pupil spending go through the roof just by math. As a result, practices that were common before are now, kind of been luxuriated out of existence. And because we had money to spend. We didn't spend it with intentionality. We didn't spend it with an eye toward moving the needle on the most important metrics. We spent it to make, both, I wouldn't say our lives easier, but everybody's, all the squeaky wheels got greased because there was plenty of grease to go around. I think you guys coming in may have the impression that, that's the way they wanted it to be. I think that's just the way it turned out. And I think what you're hearing, certainly from me and I think from others, is that it's a good time to go back on those. And if they seem off to you, then please raise them. And I think you will find that most of the board says, we never thought that was never a value. And I think you'll find that we want to allocate the money toward the things that are the most impactful. You look like you want to say something.
Well, I think this is exactly why I'm glad that I think it was the perfect thing to bring up, because I think that there were probably some misconceptions, and I'm not sure that all board members were on the same page about that. So it's exactly the kind of thing that we need to know, and whether or not it's a big issue. If it happens at 4 sites, we're talking $600,000, I'd say that's a big issue, right?
You know, on that particular issue, if it's a big issue when you're talking about one school, but it's not a big issue if you change to what we had discussed as a board, which was to keep people, keep families in their clusters. And so if we went and did that, if Jim, if you went and did that and it's no longer a big issue, then maybe we don't have to have a whole conversation about it at the board.
Jim, you had something you wanted to say?
Well, those are good examples. There are three things that I've seen that we do in practice that I've been told are pretty much untouchable, and that's why we're bringing that. It's the neighborhood mandate, the 14-day, one of the things that we do in this district, which is just different, and so I bring this to the board's attention, is whenever there are changes in enrollment at school sites, we add, but we never subtract. So this is this is another example that I've been told that is a sacred cow, that is something that we can only add, but we never subtract. So this is a year that we are down from our enrollment adjustments, but we added staffing. It doesn't really make sense when you're down a couple hundred kids and you add staffing. It's because we never detriment a school. Now, I am, again, not placing value on that because it's very disruptive to collapse classes after day 14. I get it. I understand why districts may not want to do that. But there is a cost to that. And so in terms of quantifying it, Don was correct. 1 year, if kids come in little bunches that are all perfect, it may not cost us anything. Neighborhood school mandates, we have issues with our, in special ed, we have some small classes because we have the neighborhood mandate for special ed too. So we have some small classes that could potentially be combined. Are those things that we want to do? So we've got the and we don't do combination classes in this district either. So that's something that would be pretty common in many other districts. And again, is that optimal? I'm not saying it is, but those are three things that you've asked me to bring the fresh eyes, or that we do that are different than what other districts do. Those are three things that most districts don't do, and I'm not saying that we should or shouldn't.
So if they're material, let's just go back to what Ken said. If they're material, and if you've gone back and made sure you understand what the original decision was there, like whether we're talking about an individual school, or I was just told we're calling them quadrants, not clusters anymore, but whatever we're calling them, if that's still true, then you should bring it back. If it's no longer true, then bring something else, you know, whatever is true.
Perfect.
That's a problem.
Thank you.
Right, okay. Thank you. Unless there are other comments right now, I would like to take our cards, and then we can, you know, come back and see if there's anything else we need
You
to
know
add.
what,
Yes.
if I could add one other topic up, just because I think
You
it's
may.
important to do, because I promised at the first interim to bring this up at a different time, and I'm anticipating a response from Mr. Dauber already on this, is, I get it, make a recommendation. But I do want to,
Heard loud and clear.
I've learned, I'm a good learner. But I do want to bring up the issue that I brought up when we talked about the PERS and STIRS. So the PERS and STIRS have gone up significantly over the last 7 or 8 years. And there's a schedule that hopefully it will end in the next 2 years, the massive increases. And that has been a huge strain on our budget. But, and this is what I brought up, and I've had conversations with Mr. Collins about this, is the city of Palo Alto has employed their own study because they don't believe that the discount rate that PERS is using is valid. And their study shows that it's not, or at least that's their belief. And I can tell you in 2018, the way the stock market has behaved, their discount rate is significantly overstated. So there is a belief that the increases in PERS cost and STIRS will continue. That's not in statute, it's not anything that's required right now, but it's on the horizon. So is that something that is of interest to the board or not, to set aside additional funds right now? And do we want to anticipate additional STIRS and PERS fundings? That would be something that I can tell you that probably no school districts in California are doing. It's difficult because you're putting aside current resources for future increases. But if you ask me if it's wise, absolutely it is. It makes a lot of sense, but it's a lot of pain to do that because you're going to have to put aside current year resources. Correct me if I'm wrong, I think the city of Palo Alto's number is somewhere around $4 million a year, $5 million now. Okay, $5 million a year that they have to set aside that comes out of the budget. So,
Since I put Mr. Novak, Jim, up to this, can I just speak briefly to it?
You may.
Thank you. Thank you for bringing that up. I appreciate it. As I think most of you know, maybe all of you, the city did a study last year that included actuarial work as well as looking at developing their own estimate for STRS and PERS long-term return rate that led them to the conclusion that they should actually, they wanted to set aside 8 million, but they decided to do it in 2 chunks. So, and they're still struggling to achieve the first chunk of cost reduction to set money aside. So my suggestion to Jim was that we should do a similar study to try to figure out if that also applies to us, and if so, then we can decide what to do with it. So the proposal that I'd make is not that we make a decision about whether to set aside a chunk of money. It's to do a study, which will cost money. I think the city spent 40 or 50 grand on their study. Now we have the benefit of the work they did, so that might be useful, to figure out if this is something that we should be doing in order to more prudently manage our future obligations. I'd be very supportive of that because I really, really worry about this. And you're right, no school district has done it. I think almost no cities have done it, but one that did is the city of Palo Alto. So,
Anybody have any comments about that?
I think that's a great idea. I think it's, we owe it to future students essentially to make sure that our spending level is prudent.
I would be supportive of a study. I would like to make sure that we're looking at it in context. We are a small suburban or medium-sized suburban district. There are some districts that are enormous, like LA Unified. And I have to believe that we need to understand what they're thinking about along this as well, because we're not going to drive the state. Maybe we will drive the state. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe we study it and we realize we will drive the state. I would be surprised if we are the driver rather than some of the bigger school districts. So I'd be very interested in how they're talking about this.
Shawnick? Okay, I'm certainly interested in learning more. Not ready for any commitments to it, but I'd like to know, what does that mean? How much do you recommend setting aside, and what does that mean?
I'll reach out to the city of Palo Alto and work with the same consultants that they had, at least to understand a little bit more and bring something back to the board.
Yeah, we can really benefit from the work that the city has done here, so thank you. Now, I would like to take our comments. I think we have 4. Jocelyn Levy, then Michelle Higgins, Christina Schmidt, and Ann Lee. You've got 3 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you. I think some of the points I'm going to cover are going to be covered by some other speakers later. My name is Jocelyn Levy. I am the PTAC Environmental Action Chair, and I want to talk about 2 things. One is the need for a consistent health and nutrition and environmental science curriculum throughout the district. I think that depending on which elementary school you are at, you are getting a different education. I know that is part of the individual choice elements of each school has its own character. However, there is a difference of opportunity depending on which school you're at and what you're getting. I'm strongly in favor of school gardens. There has been some action about incorporating produce at the individual gardens into our nutrition program, and I believe that that would help with our general health, but also a sense of place. When you are connected to your schools, you are eating your own produce, you are learning about the environment, you are learning about science, you are learning about everything around you. So as we're considering our budget, I would like us to consider, if possible, a position where there is a coordinator who is working with health and wellness, working with the nutrition department, working with the science department to have a consistent effort across the school district where everything is uniform. Every school is going to have their individual idiosyncrasies because that is the way that we operate. However, there needs to be a baseline so that we know that everything is covered. My second point would be that as the Environmental Action Chair, I very much want to make sure that any efforts we make in creating new buildings and structures take into account the changing climate. We have hotter summers, we have drier conditions. We need to make sure that we keep in mind that anything that we create keeps an eye to that, whether that's increasing the use of solar, whether that's planting more trees, whether that's including more shade structures, keeping in mind we may need to think about air conditioning, although that's not the most environmentally friendly option. And finally, I would like to keep in mind that there are some movements in the city, although I don't believe that it is formalized, to move towards compostable utensils and supplies in the district and in the food services. And that's something that will need a budget item because it is a little bit more expensive. And we need to keep in mind that there are some changes that may be coming down the pipeline. So,
Thank you.
thank you.
I think Ms. Higgins was next. Michelle Higgins, Christina Schmidt, Ann Lee.
Hi, I'm speaking today on behalf of, as VP of Community Outreach for PTA Council, and I'm speaking specifically on equity and access for the budget, and it's a little bit of a checklist, so I apologise. So first up, we're asking for funding to support the equity mission to close the achievement gap and hire an equity officer as recommended by the MATD. The role should include support as central resource for families wanting resolution for bias and equity-related issues, as well as central resource for district programs and personnel evaluation regarding effectiveness and bias for students being addressed by MATD. We also need a specific focus on students who are meeting LCAP standards but have outcomes disproportionately lower than their peers. Funding to increase student and parent engagement and eliminate the achievement gap for underrepresented groups, including HUR, low SES, students with special education needs. Funding to continue the Family Engagement Specialist Program and increase capacity with family engagement efforts. Funding to fully implement special education plan approved by the board in June of 2018. Funding to initiate a middle school dyslexia pilot program in 2019. Funding for Tier 2 and Tier 3 dyslexia interventions and scheduling in secondary school. Funding the hire of a district MTSS district coordinator to provide mentorship, coaching and oversight of intervention within the tiered system of support and across all schools. MTSS RTI specialists report annual progress on the district's dyslexia work with data on reading outcomes. Funding for intensive academic supports for at-risk middle school students not enrolled in programs like Dreamcatchers. The program should look to the model of the focus on success, academic strategy and skills classes that are already in our middle schools. Funding for on-site after-school tutoring at semester start for at-risk students, including bus transport options for students travelling from East Palo Alto. And funding for an additional bus for middle school students travelling from East Palo Alto. The one bus currently delivers students to all 3 middle schools, resulting in an unnecessary early departure time for all and a lengthy journey for students, particularly at Green, who are the last stop on this particular route. I have some time, so I'll move on to wellness and safety now. Funding for staff in health and wellness to actively manage nutrition and health across the district. Funding for breakfast, brunch program at every site for students qualifying for free and reduced meals. I note that there's no breakfast program in either high school. I'm not sure if any of the middle schools have a program.
Thank you, Ms. Higgins.
Thank you.
Christina Schmidt and Ann Lee.
I have a very unusual voice right now, so if I fade in and out, excuse me. I am the Vice President of the PTA Council, and I want to thank you for having this meeting today. The leadership of the council want to share some of our perspectives. Obviously, you've already heard from Michelle. And I think what's important to say right now is that we strongly suggest that the board fund programs that implement policies and practices that encourage participation between families, schools, and the community stakeholders, and indeed all of our stakeholders, to ensure full access and maximize student success. We understand what our 3 priority goals are that were approved in October 2017 by the board: high-quality teaching and learning, equity and wellness and safety. I would like to go through some of the high-quality teaching and learning suggestions. One is funding to increase professional development and co-teaching models across all grades, supporting equity and special education goals and providing differentiated learning as stated in the district strategic plan for all students, including twice exceptional students, and supporting smaller classrooms in secondary education. Funding to increase professional development, to improve methodologies for inclusion, professional collaboration and learning, and unconscious bias training for staff, students, administrators, and families. We would also like to have funding for MTSS-RTI initiatives in general education and supporting data-driven, evidence-based practices across all sites to serve diverse learners and at-risk students. Last, we'd also like to ask for funding that is consistent with transparent communication regarding assessments, academics, wellness, and program assessment. I'm not really sure where Michelle left off now, but I just wanted to highlight a few of the wellness and safety suggestions that we made, which is funding for consistent unified SEL programs developed and supported through K-12 with an emphasis on primary and middle schools. With that, you've all received our letter. They are suggested. They are only a beginning of where this conversation is going. So we really look forward to being able to participate with you further. We are the stakeholders in this community. Our children are part of that. And we really do appreciate being invited to these sessions and to speak with you individually as well as a group to let you know that we represent our children and who we are, as you do. And we want to work with you to do this well. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
Thank you. Ann Lee?
Thank you so much. My name is Ann Lee, a part of the PTAC Health and Wellness Committee, and I'm also a physician. I want to thank you so much for this opportunity to hear from the community, and I certainly appreciate this opportunity to share with you. So I actually wanted to take this time to share the statement by the California Department of Public Health that came out in November 2017 on cell phone safety. And they did make some recommendations in terms of overexposure and limited exposure for children. And although we have, policies in our classrooms for no cell phone use, we have Wi-Fi routers, which actually emit the same kind of RF radiation as cell phones. And as opposed to cell phones, which we can turn on and off at our leisure, we are not able to do that with Wi-Fi routers. There are no studies to actually show that prolonged exposure to this kind of radiation is safe for anyone, but especially our children. And as I discussed before with some of you, that the FCC standard is actually based on a fully grown male adult, at least 75 kilograms, not based on young children who are half or even fourth of that size. So as mentioned before, the Health, Nutrition, Environmental, and Environmental Science Education Program element to be funded and to include education for health for our children. I think that it would be also I'm sorry, I'm losing my words here. I think it would also be helpful for children to understand what overexposures to EMF radiation can also do. As far as funding, I appreciate that the IT department is working on measuring the amount of RF exposure that our children are experiencing in our classrooms on a continuous basis. However, I do believe that we should get some funding to adequately measure our RF exposures on our children by a professional building biologist. I think this is fair to the community and also fair for the safety of our children, which I know that we're all concerned about. So thank you very much.
Thank you. No more cards? Okay, great. Thank you, everyone. Staff, is there any other questions you have for us? Anything else you need to know?
No, I'd just like to thank the entire board. Today was very helpful, insightful, and we can move on some of the direction that we received today. So thank you, and thank you to the staff for preparing for today.
Colleagues, anybody have anything to add?
Thank you.
I just wanted to say two things. One is I would like recommendations. I'd like to see recommendations next time. My dream would be you come with an analysis of all the money that we're spending, and all the alternatives, and an assessment of what's the best resulting mix of spending for the future. So that's my dream. I don't expect you to meet that, but that's the North Star from my perspective. I also wanted to mention, in regard to sacred cows, a couple of speakers mentioned nutrition, and the board adopted a change to the district's nutrition policy. And Mr. Shen, who I think has left, was involved in that. And one of the things that changed is that we had previously had a policy essentially that the school lunch program needed to be sort of self-funding, and that restriction was removed in the latest revision to the board policy. So I just want to call that to your attention because that has been an assumption in the district that has changed. I also want to just call out Mr. Shen and PTAC for their advocacy on issues of student health and nutrition, because it's been very effective, I think, in changing specific policies.
Anyone else?
I just want to thank Dr. Austin, Mr. Novak, and everybody else, because, I'm sorry, Jim, Don, and everyone else. Because I do think this is a hard process. You know, we do it every year, but we don't always do it well. And I think, you know, this, in my mind, is probably the most important thing. After hiring the superintendent, the most important thing that the board does is allocate resources. And I think we collectively feel like we haven't done a great job in the past. You know, I vividly remember arguing about $11,000 high school volunteer coordinator positions, keep them or let them go. And it's like, this can't be right on a $250 million organization that isn't achieving all its goals. So, you know, I really appreciate that you're willing to put in the effort to do a reset on that and help guide us in a more productive direction. So thank you for what you've done, and thank you for what you're going to do.
I also want to thank staff. I want to thank everyone on the board, and also Todd for, you know, giving a little bit of a different direction into what this process is supposed to look like, because I don't think any of us really knew what it was supposed to look like. We had our ideas and our experiences, and I think that we've sort of come to a good point now where, you know, we're at a good point going forward, and we'd like to see recommendations, and then we'll be, of course, happy to give our own. But yeah, this was a very illuminating process, I think, and even though we didn't come away from it with specific suggestions, I think we do have a specific direction that we'd like to move in terms of process.
Let's talk bug. Do you want to mention, because I saw you included all the Let's Talk.
Would you like to speak really quickly, Don, about the Let's Talk? Or
Yeah, so Let's Talk budget was implemented maybe about 3 or 4 weeks ago, something like that, is when the button actually came up. Now it's been launched wide scale, but we had comments for a few weeks. I cut them off as of December 5th so that I could actually have the comments. But if you'll notice on there, they are taken verbatim, right from every single response that came in. I did 0 editing of it. I just reformatted the columns. I think I had a comment from one of the board members that it says customer, and maybe we'll change that in terms of the label, in terms of who the different person is that responded. But they're taken exactly off that. So I wanted to be transparent with the board so they could read word for word. The only way I'll edit any of the comments is if they're just inappropriate comments that we cannot publish, but I'll put everything there. So I encourage the board to look through each one of those comments.
Great. It seems like it's off to a great start and a way for community members who might not otherwise be clear how they might communicate with us quickly and easily to do it that way. So I'd also like to thank the staff and my colleagues for today. I think hopefully you have been given some direction, clearly direction that we want you to give us direction and recommendations. But also you've learned more about some of the values that we do have, clarified them, or even perhaps have some minor changes to them. So we look forward to the next budget study session next month, I believe. And if there's nothing else, this meeting's adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. And bring us in 11 minutes.